Is that dirt under your nails, or do you people just come that way? The woman said, glancing at Namdi's hands as he stowed his bag. Her mouth doing something that was not quite a smile. I'm sure there's a hygiene standard for who they let sit up here. Propolis, Namdi said, settling into 6A. B resin. It doesn't wash out for about 3 days. And you're right that there's a standard. I met it, which is why I have this seat. She turned away. He opened the journal he'd brought. An issue of a pollinator ecology, quarterly he'd been meaning to read for a month, and did not think about her again. He would think about her 4 hours later, when the cabin was full of 11,000 honeybees, and she was standing on her seat, screaming and swinging her jacket, and he would have approximately 9 seconds to stop her before she turned an inconvenience into a mass casualty event. To understand why Namdi Eze could hear the difference between a calm swarm and a defensive one, you have to understand 51 years of listening to bees. Namdi was 56 years old and had been an agricultural entomologist for 31 of them, and a beekeeper for 51, which was the more important number. He had started at 5, in his grandfather's apiary outside Enugu, standing at the tree line in a veil that was too big for him while his grandfather worked the hives without gloves and talked continuously. In the low, even voice that Namdi would later understand was not for the child's benefit, but for the bees. His grandfather had told him. That first summer, the sentence that had organized the next 51 years, they are not angry. They are never angry. They are afraid. Or they are calm. Everything else you think you see is your own fear wearing their face. He had built a career on that sentence. He worked now for an agricultural research institute in Nairobi, specializing in pollinator health and the behavior of managed bee populations under stress. And he had published 43 papers. And he consulted for agricultural ministries in 9 countries. And he had spent 31 years demonstrating, in careful experimental language, that his grandfather had been correct about almost everything. His particular technical specialty, the thing that distinguished his work, was acoustic behavioral analysis. Bees communicated their colony state through sound. Not just the waggle dance, which everyone knew about, but the ambient acoustic signature of the hive, the wing beat frequency, the collective hum, the specific harmonic profile that shifted measurably depending on whether the colony was foraging, swarming, queenless, overheated, or defensive. He could hear the difference. Not from a spectrogram, though, he used those too, but with his ears. From across a field, a calm colony hummed at roughly 190 to 250 hertz. A defensive colony spiked toward 300 and above, with a specific rasping overtone that came from the wing beat pattern of bees in alarm posture. The difference was audible to anyone who had spent 51 years listening for it, and inaudible as a distinction to almost everyone else, who heard only times buzzing times and translated it through their own nervous system into times threat. He was flying to Amsterdam for a 3-day conference on pollinator decline in East African agricultural systems, where he was giving the keynote. He had his slides. He had his journal. He had, in the cargo hold beneath him, a shipment that he had personally inspected and signed off on before departure, 240 queen bees in individual cages, each with a small retinue of attendant workers, plus 3 sealed transport nucleus colonies, destined for a breeding program in the Netherlands. 11,000 bees, approximately, properly contained, properly ventilated, properly documented. He had checked the containment himself. The containment was not the problem. Let me tell you who else was in this aircraft. Because a story about 11,000 insects is really a story about 260 mammals and what they do when they are frightened. The woman in 6B, who had asked about his fingernails, was named Cordula Vandenberg. 52. Dutch. A hospitality industry consultant returning from a hotel project in Nairobi. She had the specific, brittle fastidiousness of someone who had organized her entire relationship to the world around the management of contamination, real and imagined, and who experienced other people primarily as vectors. She would become, within 9 seconds of the first bee reaching the cabin, the most dangerous person on the aircraft. There was a flight attendant named Wanjiru, 29, Kenyan, 5 years with the carrier, who had grown up on a small holding in Muranga where her family had kept 3 hives behind the maze, and who therefore had alone among the crew a nervous system that did not classify a bee as an emergency. There was a man named Dr. Anton Reinders, 63, Dutch, an allergist and immunologist traveling home from a medical conference. In seat 12C, whose professional life had been spent treating exactly the reaction that was about to occur in row 19. There was a boy named Kelvin Muthoni, 9 years old, traveling in 19D with his mother, who had a diagnosed severe Hymenoptera venom allergy and who carried in his mother's bag in the overhead bin 2 epinephrine auto-injectors. His mother's name was Grace. She had checked the auto-injectors twice before boarding, as she checked them before every flight, as she had checked them before every journey of any kind, since Kelvin was 4 years old and had been stung once in a garden in Nakuru and had stopped breathing in 11 minutes. There was the senior purser, a man named Kwesi, 44, Ghanaian, 17 years with the carrier, who would have to make the decisions. And there was the cargo hold, where a plastic transport crate containing 3 sealed nucleus colonies had shifted during a turbulence episode over southern Sudan, and where the shift had cracked the ventilation panel of the middle crate, and where the crack had widened over 90 minutes of vibration, and where the bees, sensing an opening, following the specific behavioral logic that made them, bees had begun to move through it. The hold was ventilated to the cabin. Most holds were. It was a design feature, not a flaw. The bees found the vent at hour 4. Namdi heard them before he saw them. He was reading an article on Varroa resistance in East African honeybee subspecies, and he heard, at the very edge of his auditory attention, a sound that did not belong in an aircraft cabin. It was faint. It was buried under the engine roar and the airflow and the general acoustic mass of a wide body at cruise. It would have been inaudible to almost anyone, and meaningless to anyone who did have the auditory acuity to catch it. To Namdi, it was as legible as speech. Wing beat frequency, approximately 220 hertz. Small number of individuals, 5. Maybe 8? Flight pattern acoustically consistent with orientation flight rather than defensive flight. The bees were exploring, not attacking. Calm, curious, slightly disoriented. He set down the journal. He looked up at the ceiling, at the air return vents along the upper sidewall, and he saw the first one, a single worker, moving in the loose, looping pattern of a bee that had emerged into an unfamiliar space and was mapping it. He stood up. Not quickly. He had learned, at 7 years old, in an apiary in Enugu, that the speed of your movement was the first thing a bee read about you, and that fast movement in the vicinity of bees was a statement, and that the statement was time's predator. He moved to the galley the way his grandfather had moved between hives, which was the way you moved through a room where a sleeping child was, deliberately, without hurry, taking up no more space than necessary. Wanjiru was in the galley. There are bees in the cabin, he said. I need you to listen to me very carefully, because the next 4 minutes will determine whether this is an inconvenience or a mass casualty event. And the difference is entirely in how the cabin behaves. Wanjiru looked at him, Then, past him, at the loose looping shape of a single worker moving over row 8. She did not flinch. "How many?" she said. Something in Namdi's chest relaxed by approximately 2%. She had asked a question instead of reacting. That meant she had a framework. "I hear 5 to 8 in the cabin currently," he said. "There are 11,000 in the hold. It's my shipment, queen bees and 3 nucleus colonies, for a breeding program in Rotterdam. If the containment has failed the way I think it has, more are coming." 11,000, Wanjiru said. "They are not going to attack anyone." Namdi said, "Not unless we make them. That is the entire situation. Bees in an unfamiliar space with no colony to defend and no queen pheromone orienting them are not defensive. They are lost. They will look for light, and they will cluster, and they will wait." He held her eyes. "But if 260 people start screaming and swinging and crushing them, the alarm pheromone released from every crushed bee will mark the people around it. And the bees that are currently lost will become bees that are defending themselves. And then we will have a serious problem in a sealed metal tube." Wanjiru's face did something complicated. "My grandmother kept hives," she said. "Then you know." Namdi said, "I know." She said, "I need the purser." "Yes." Namdi said, "And I need the PA." Kwesi arrived in 90 seconds, which was fast, and he arrived with his professional face fully assembled. And he listened to Nnamdi's 90-second summary with the specific stillness of a man who was calculating in the background while the front of him stayed calm. "You want the PA," Kwesi said. "I want the PA before the cabin notices." Namdi said, "Right now there are 8 bees in a cabin of 260 people, and almost nobody has looked up. In 10 minutes there will be 200, and the situation will be defined by whoever screams first, if the passengers hear it from me. Calmly. Before they see it, we shape the response. If they see it first, the response shapes us." Kwesi looked at the ceiling. 2 workers were now visible, moving in the loose exploratory pattern over the forward cabin. "You're the shipper," Kwesi said. "I'm the entomologist." Namdi said, "I signed the containment inspection. I'll answer for that on the ground. Right now, I'm the only person on this aircraft who knows what these animals will do and what will make them do something else. And I need you to let me talk to 260 people for 90 seconds. Kwesi made the decision in 3 seconds. Namdi would remember, afterward, that it had been 3 seconds, and would think about how much of the outcome had been contained in a man's willingness to move fast on someone else's expertise. "Come with me," Kwesi said. The PA announcement was the intervention. Everything after it was execution. Namdi stood in the forward galley with the handset and spoke in the voice his grandfather had used at the hive's low. Unhurried. The specific evenness that was not performed calm, but the actual acoustic signature of a nervous system that was not alarmed. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Nnamdi Eze. I am an entomologist. I want to tell you something before you notice it yourself, so that you hear it from me, and not from your own surprise. There are honeybees in this cabin. They have come from a shipment in the cargo hold, which is mine, and which I will be answering for. There will be more of them over the next hour, possibly a great many more. I need you to understand 3 things. The first is that these bees are not going to sting you unless you make them. They have no colony here and no honey to defend. They are disoriented and they are looking for light. A bee that is exploring is not a bee that is attacking. And almost every bee you will see in this cabin tonight is exploring. The second is that the single thing that will turn this from an inconvenience into an injury is swatting. When a bee is crushed, it releases a chemical alarm signal, and that signal marks whoever crushed it. and the bees nearby respond to that marking. One person swatting can create a defensive response that would not otherwise have existed anywhere on this aircraft. I am asking you, as clearly as I know, how do not swat. Do not swing. Do not crush. If a bee lands on you, let it. It will leave. They always leave. The third is that I will be moving through the cabin for the next hour. And the cabin crew will be with me. And we will be collecting them. There is a method. It works. I have done it for 51 years. If you are frightened, that is reasonable. Fear is reasonable. I am only asking you to be frightened with your hands still. Thank you. He handed the handset back to Kwesi. Kwesi said, quietly, 51 years? I started at 5. Namdi said, the announcement bought them 40 minutes. It did not buy them, Cordula Vandenberg. She had listened to the announcement the way she listened to most things, which was as a description of a problem that other people were failing to solve adequately. When the first bee entered her personal airspace at 6B, a single worker, moving in the loose orientation pattern. At a distance of perhaps 40 centimeters, she stood up on her seat and began to swing her jacket. Namdi was 11 rows back. He heard the change in the acoustic signature before he turned. The wing beat frequency of that single worker jumped from 220 to over 300 hertz in less than a second, and acquired the specific rasping overtone that meant the animal had gone from exploring to fleeing to defending. In the compressed sequence that took a bee about a third of a second to run, he had approximately 9 seconds. He knew this precisely, because he had measured it. The propagation time of an alarm pheromone plume in still air at cabin temperature and pressure was one of the things his lab had characterized. And the answer was that the isopentyl acetate released by an alarmed bee reached behavioral concentration in a 2-meter radius in roughly 9 seconds. 9 seconds before the bees, within 2 meters of Cordula Vandenberg, received the chemical signal that a threat existed at her coordinates. He moved. He did not run. Running would have been another predator signal, and would have created its own cascade in the cabin. He moved at the specific fast walk that his grandfather had used when a hive was about to go. And he reached row 6 in 5 seconds. And he did the thing that 51 years had made available to him, which was to put his own body between the alarmed bee and the woman. He raised his hand slowly, palm open, upward into the space the bee was occupying. The bee landed on his palm. It was, he would think later, the most fortunate thing that happened all night. And it was not entirely luck. A bee in alarm posture, looking for a target selected on the basis of movement, dark color, and carbon dioxide. He had presented a still, upward-facing, open hand, which was none of those things, and which was the specific presentation that 51 years had taught him read to a bee as times not a threat, and also a surface. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had not changed from the PA voice. "Sit down. Please sit down. It's on my hand now. Sit down." Cordula Vandenberg looked at him, standing on her seat with her jacket in her fist, and looked at the bee on his open palm. And something in the arrangement, the calm, the stillness, the fact that the man had put his own bare hand into the place her fear had been got through. She sat down. The whole thing had taken 11 seconds. 3 passengers in the surrounding rows had half risen. All 3 sat back down. Namdi stood in the aisle with a bee on his palm and let his own pulse come down. Because his pulse was data too, and the bees would read it. "I'm going to walk this one to the galley," he said, to the rows around him, in the same even voice. "You'll see me doing this for the next hour. It's all right. Please stay seated." He walked the bee to the galley. Behind him, in row chest, Cordula Fondenberg put her face in her hands. The alarm pheromone plume dissipated without cascading. This was the second fortunate thing, and it was less luck than the first. The aircraft's cabin air was exchanged completely every 2 to 3 minutes, which was faster than any terrestrial environment Namdi had ever worked in. And the ventilation carried the isopenyl acetate away before it reached behavioral concentration at any distance from Cordula's row. He noted this, professionally. Even in the middle of it, cabin air exchange as a pheromone dispersal mechanism. Nobody had studied that. Nobody had needed to. He would write about it later. He wrote about everything later. The method was simple, which was why it worked. Bees in an unfamiliar enclosed space did 3 things. They moved toward light, they moved upward, and eventually, in the absence of a queen to orient around, they clustered somewhere high and dark adjacent and waited to die or be found. You did not chase them. Chasing was predation. You gave them somewhere to go. Namdi had Wanjiru dim the cabin lighting to its lowest setting, except for a single galley work light, which they positioned to throw a bright pool against the forward bulkhead. Then he had her bring him every clear plastic cup on the aircraft, and the airline's paper napkins, and a roll of the clear tape used for securing catering carts. Then he waited. 20 minutes into the dimmed cabin, the bees began to move toward the galley light, in ones and twos, and then in a slow, persistent trickle. And they began to cluster on the bulkhead above it in the specific loose beard shape that a queenless cluster made. He collected them off the bulkhead with the cup and napkin method that every beekeeper on Earth learned in their first month. Cup over the bee. Napkin slid underneath. Cup inverted. Bee contained. Transferred into the empty catering cart that Wanjiru had lined and sealed and converted into a holding container. He collected for 55 minutes. Wanjiru collected beside him for the last 30. After watching him do it for 25, and then simply picking up a cup and starting without asking, in the specific way of someone whose hands already knew, they collected roughly 400 bees. Approximately 10,600 remained in the hold. In row 19. At the 50-minute mark, Kelvin Muthoni was stung. It was nobody's fault. It was one bee, disoriented, that had come down between the seatbacks and had landed on the boy's forearm. And the boy, 9 years old, allergic, terrified, who had been holding absolutely still for 50 minutes because his mother had held his other hand and told him to, had flinched. The bee stung him. Then it died. Because that is what happens. Grace Muthoni had the first auto-injector out of the bag and into her son's thigh in under 40 seconds, which was faster than most trained clinicians managed, because she had rehearsed it in her mind approximately 4,000 times over 5 years. Dr. Anton Reinders was there in 90 seconds. Wanjiru had gone for him at the first sound. Namdi arrived with the medical kit and did not touch the boy, because he was not a physician, and this was not his domain. And he had learned the specific discipline of knowing where his expertise ended. What he did instead was take the stinger out. He did it with the edge of a boarding pass, scraping laterally, rather than pulling, because pulling squeezed the venom sac and delivered the remaining dose. It took 4 seconds. It was the single most useful thing anyone did in the first 2 minutes. And Reinders said so afterward. And it was a thing Namdi had done 10,000 times on himself and on other people, and which almost no one outside beekeeping and emergency medicine knew. How much venom? Reinders said. Partial dose, Namdi said. Scrape was fast. He got maybe 60% of a full sting. That's meaningful, Reinders said, and went back to the boy. Kelvin's response to the epinephrine was good. His airway held. His blood pressure, which Reinders was tracking manually with the kit's cuff, stabilized within 7 minutes. But he had one auto-injector left. And anaphylaxis was biphasic in a meaningful percentage of cases. The second wave could arrive 4 to 8 hours after the first, and they were 5.5 hours from Amsterdam. Reinders straightened up and said, "Too crazy. You need to put this aircraft on the ground within 90 minutes. One remaining dose and a biphasic risk window is not a survivable configuration for a 9-year-old at altitude." Kwesi went forward. The captain's name was Ingrid Halvorsen, 51. Norwegian, 19 years with the carrier. And she made the diversion decision in under 2 minutes on the basis of Reinder's medical assessment. Cairo, 95 minutes. She came on the PA herself, which she did not always do. And she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are diverting to Cairo for a medical emergency involving a young passenger. We will be on the ground in approximately 95 minutes, and there will be medical personnel meeting the aircraft. I also want to say something about what has happened in this cabin over the past hour. When Dr. Eze made his announcement, he asked 260 of you to be frightened with your hands still. Almost every one of you did that. I have been flying for 19 years, and I want to tell you plainly that what you did was not a small thing, and that a different cabin, on a different night, would have produced a different outcome. Thank you. Please remain seated with your belts fastened." Namdi sat down in 6A for the first time in 90 minutes. Cordula Vandenberg was in 6B. She said, without looking at him, "I nearly caused it." "Yes," Namdi said. She flinched at the plainness of it. He was not being cruel. He was being accurate. And he had found, across 56 years, that accuracy was usually the kinder thing in the long run, and almost never in the short one. "I panicked," she said. "You did," he said. "Panic is not a moral failure. It's a nervous system doing what nervous systems do." He paused. "What I would ask you to look at is not the panic. It's the thing you said to me at boarding." She was silent for a long moment. "That has nothing to do with." "It has everything to do with it." And Namdi said, still in the even voice, still without heat, when the bee came, "The only person in your immediate vicinity who knew what to do was a man you had decided, 2 hours earlier and without any information, was beneath the standard of the cabin. Your body could not take instruction from me because your mind had already sorted me. That sorting cost us 11 seconds and very nearly cost us a great deal more." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you for an apology. I'm telling you where the failure was. Because you seem like a person who prefers to know." Cordula Vandenberg looked at her hands, which had propolis on them now, transferred from the seat back where he had steadied himself. "I do prefer to know," she said. "I don't enjoy it." "No," Namdi said. "Very few people do." The flashback came to him in the last 40 minutes into Cairo. The way the important ones came not as nostalgia, but as instruction arriving exactly when it was needed. He was 7 years old, and his grandfather had taken the veil off him. They were standing at the third hive in the row, in the late afternoon, and his grandfather had reached over and lifted the veil from Namdi's head and folded it and put it under his arm. Namdi had been terrified. He had gone rigid and had begun, immediately, to breathe fast. "Stop." His grandfather had said, "Listen to the hive. Tell me what it is doing." "It's angry," Namdi had said, in a voice that came out very small. "Listen again." He had listened. He had heard, past his own heartbeat, the low, continuous hum of a colony that was doing nothing at all except being a colony. "It's the same," he had said. "It sounds the same as before." "It is the same." His grandfather said, "Nothing changed when I took your veil off. Nothing at all. The only thing that changed was inside you. He put his hand on the back of Namdi's neck. That is the whole lesson. Everything else I teach you for the next 20 years is a detail of this. The hive is telling you the truth continuously. Your fear is telling you something else. Learn which one you are listening to. Namdi had stood at that hive for 4 more minutes, unveiled, and had not been stung, and had felt his own breathing come down to something that matched the hum. He had been listening ever since. He had built a laboratory and a career and 43 papers on the technical elaboration of a lesson delivered by an old man in an apiary in 1976. Learn which one you are listening to. He had listened tonight. He had heard 220 hertz and known it was exploration. He had heard the jump to 300 and known he had 9 seconds. He had heard, underneath everything, 260 human nervous systems deciding, one at a time, whether to be frightened with their hands still. They had decided, well, mostly. Enough. Cairo received the aircraft at 3:40 a.m. local time, and the medical team was at the door before the seatbelt sign was off. Kelvin Muthoni was taken to Cairo University Hospital with Reinders accompanying him, and he did not have a biphasic reaction. And he was discharged 40 hours later. And he flew to Amsterdam with his mother, 4 days after that, on a flight that carried, as far as anyone knew, no bees at all. Namdi did not go to the hospital. He went to the cargo hold with the Egyptian ground handling supervisor and 2 members of the airline's cargo team. And he opened the hold. And he found what he had expected to find, the middle nucleus crate with a ventilation panel cracked along a stress line, and approximately 10,000 bees clustered in the dark of the hold in a single large beard on the underside of the cargo netting. Quiet. Cold. Waiting. Bees at 15 degrees Celsius did almost nothing. The hold had been cold. That was the 3rd fortunate thing. He worked for 6 hours in the Cairo hold with a smoker he borrowed from a beekeeper in Giza whom the ground supervisor knew and phoned at 4 in the morning. And he recovered the cluster into 2 replacement nucleus boxes. And he verified the surviving queens. And he documented everything with the specific completeness of a man who knew he would be writing an incident report that other people would use. He lost 41 queens. He saved 199. He counted them himself. The accounting. The crate failure was traced to a manufacturing defect in a batch of transport nucleus boxes, a resin flaw along the ventilation panel seam that had passed visual inspection and had failed under sustained vibration. 17 other crates from the same batch were in service across 4 countries. All 17 were recalled within 11 days. Namdi's incident report ran to 31 pages. It included the crate failure analysis, the escape route through the hold ventilation, the cabin behavioral response, the acoustic data he had reconstructed from memory and later verified against his own laboratory's reference recordings, and a section that had no precedent in the literature, which he titled Times Cabin Air Exchange as an Alarm Pheromone Dispersal Mechanism, Preliminary Observation. That section became a paper. The paper became the basis for a revised IATA live insect transport protocol, which now specifies that the failure mode of an escaped Hymenoptera shipment in a pressurized cabin is behaviorally manageable if, and only if, the passenger cabin is briefed before visual detection. The protocol includes a script. The script is, with 3 word changes made by a committee. The announcement Namdi made from the forward galley over southern Egypt. Wanjiru applied for a secondment to the airline's cabin safety training department 8 months later. And got it. And taught for 6 years. And one of the modules she taught was the one she had written herself, called Times Briefing Before Detection. It was not about bees. Bees were the case study. It was about the general principle that in any cabin event where passenger behavior is the primary risk multiplier, the crew's first and most powerful intervention is information delivered calmly before the passengers generate their own. She opened every session with the same line, which she had taken directly from a man in a forward galley over Sudan. Ask them to be frightened with their hands still. They almost always can be. Dr. Anton Reinders wrote to Namdi 3 weeks after Cairo. The letter said, in part, the lateral scrape removal of the stinger reduced envenomation by an amount I would estimate at 30 to 40%. In a 9-year-old with a documented severe Hymenoptera allergy and 1 remaining autoinjector at altitude, that difference is not academic. I have taught stinger removal technique in continuing education sessions for 20 years. I have never seen it performed that fast. Where did you learn it? Namdi wrote back, from my grandfather, in 1976. At approximately age 6. He removed a sting from my arm with the edge of a bus ticket and told me that the fastest hand is worth more than the best equipment. I have removed perhaps 10,000 since. It is not a skill so much as an accumulation. Reinders replied with 1 line. Most skills are, thank you for being in seat 6A. Cordula Vandenberg wrote to him too. Eventually, 4 months later. An email, forwarded through the conference organizers, which meant she had gone to some effort to find him. It said, Dr. Eze, I have started 3 versions of this and thrown away 2. I said something to you at the gate that I would like to be able to explain, and cannot. There was no reason for it. You had done nothing. I looked at your hands and produced a sentence that I have. I now understand. Been producing in various forms for most of my adult life. Usually more quietly than I did that night. What I keep returning to is not that I was wrong about you, although I was. It is that you told me afterward, very precisely, what the cost of it had been. 11 seconds. You gave me a number. Nobody has ever given me a number before. I have been thinking about the number. I don't have a conclusion. I wanted you to know that I am not pretending it didn't happen. See, Vandenberg. He read it twice. He wrote back, Ms. Vandenberg. Thank you for writing, and for not offering me a resolution you have not reached. The number was not intended as a punishment. It was the most accurate thing I had. Accuracy is what I have instead of forgiveness, which is not mine to give, and would not be worth much if it were. What I will say is this. The bee on my hand did not know anything about either of us. It responded to stillness and open posture and the absence of threat. That is not a moral parable, and I distrust people who make it one. But it is true that the animals are indifferent to our categories. And that on that night, the only thing that mattered was who could read the situation. And that your sorting of me had no relationship whatsoever to that question. Keep thinking about the number. That is the whole of what I would ask. And Eze, he did not hear from her again. He thought that was probably correct. The conference in Amsterdam went ahead without him. He arrived 31 hours late. Having spent 6 hours in a cargo hold and 11 in a Cairo hotel, and 8 more arranging the onward transport of 199 queen bees, and he delivered his keynote in a shirt he had bought in the Cairo airport. And he opened it by explaining, briefly and factually, why he was late. Then he said, I want to make one observation that is not in my slides. I have spent 31 years studying pollinator behavior under stress. 3 days ago, I spent an hour studying human behavior under stress. In a sealed metal tube at 11,000 meters. With 11,000 of my bees loose in the ventilation. The bees behaved exactly as the literature predicts. They oriented to light. They clustered. They did not attack. Because there was nothing for them to defend. Their behavior was entirely legible to anyone who had learned to read it. The humans were harder. But here is what I want to tell this room, because it bears on everything we do in pollinator conservation, and it is the reason I am standing here instead of writing letters to a family in Nairobi. 260 people were asked to sit still, while insects they were afraid of moved through the air around them. They were given 90 seconds of accurate information and one specific instruction. And they did it. Almost all of them. For almost the whole hour. We spend a great deal of our professional lives assuming that the public cannot be reasoned with about insects that fear is fixed, that the only available strategy is removal and concealment. I have believed some version of this myself. I no longer believe it. What I saw over Sudan was a cabin full of frightened people who were given the truth. Plainly. Before they had time to invent something worse. And who then behaved better than any risk model I would have built for them. I would ask this room to consider what that implies for how we talk to the public about the animals we are trying to save. Thank you. The applause went on longer than was comfortable. He stood through it. He flew home to Nairobi on a Tuesday. He looked, out of professional habit, at the cargo manifest before boarding, and there was nothing living on it, which he noted with a small, unprofessional relief. He sat in the window seat and thought about his grandfather, dead 32 years now, who had never flown on an aircraft in his life and had never seen a country that was not the one he was born in, and who had given his grandson, at 7, without any idea what he was doing. The specific piece of equipment that had made a difference to a 9-year-old boy in row 19 and to 259 other people who would never know it. Learn which one you are listening to. He had listened. He would keep listening. He was 56 years old and had approximately 20 more years of listening in him. And after that, there would be the students, who were already listening. Some of them, in the specific way that meant it had taken. The chain was very old, older than his grandfather, older than anyone's grandfather. People had been standing at hives listening for 10,000 years. And the hum had not changed, and the lesson had not changed, and the fear had not changed either. Only the number of people you could tell at once. 90 seconds. 260 people. One handset in a forward galley. His grandfather would have found that extraordinary. Nnamdi found it extraordinary. He looked out at the Sahara going by underneath. Enormous and gold and entirely indifferent. And he listened to the aircraft, which was making the sound aircraft made, and he heard nothing in it that did not belong. He closed his eyes. He slept the whole way home. There is an hour in the middle of this story that deserves to be told properly, because it was the longest hour and the least dramatic, and the one in which the outcome was actually decided. It was the collection hour. The cabin was dim. Nnamdi had asked Wanjiru to bring the lighting down to the lowest setting the aircraft permitted, and to leave one galley work light on, angled against the forward bulkhead. The effect from the passenger cabin was of a long, dark tube with a single bright pool at the front, which was, in behavioral terms, exactly what a lost bee needed, and which was also, though he had not planned it, an unexpectedly calming thing for 260 frightened mammals. Dark rooms make people quiet. It is one of the oldest facts about us. Nnamdi walked the aisles with a stack of clear plastic cups and a pocket full of napkins, and the specific slow gait that 51 years had built into him. He walked the whole length of the cabin every 4 minutes. Not because the bees needed him to the light was doing that work, but because 260 people needed to see a man moving unhurriedly through the space with his sleeves rolled up and no veil and no gloves, picking bees off seatbacks and ceiling panels with his bare hands and a paper cup. The walking was the intervention. The collecting was almost incidental. He understood this. He had learned it. Obliquely. From 31 years of doing public engagement work about pollinators in communities where bees were feared, that the single most persuasive argument for times this animal will not hurt you times was a person standing in front of the animal, unafraid, visibly and demonstrably not being hurt. You could not argue people out of fear. You could stand in it. So he stood in it, in an aisle at 11,000 meters. For 55 minutes, he spoke to people. That had not been part of any plan. It happened because a man in 14C asked him a question, and he answered it. And then a woman in 16A asked him a different one. And by the third pass, he had understood that the questions were themselves part of the mechanism. And he began to invite them. The questions were, almost universally, good. A teenage girl in 22F asked whether the bees knew they were in an aircraft. He told her no, that a bee's navigational system was built on sun position, polarized light, and landmark memory, and that inside a metal tube with no sun and no landmarks, she was functionally in a sensory void, and that the loose looping flight pattern she was watching was an animal running a search algorithm that had no possible solution. The girl said, "That's really sad." And Namdi said, "Yes, it is." He did not soften it. She was 15 and had asked a real question and deserved a real answer. A man in 11D asked why they weren't attacking. Namdi explained the difference between a bee at a hive and a bee away from one, that defensive behavior in honeybees was almost entirely tied to colony defense, that a foraging bee 2 kilometers from her hive was one of the least aggressive animals in the world, and that every bee in this cabin was, in effect, a forager who had gotten catastrophically lost. She has nothing to defend, he said. She has no reason to spend her life on you. Stinging kills her. It is the last thing she does, and she does it only for the colony. The man was quiet for a moment and then said, "I've been swatting bees my whole life." "Most people have," Namdi said. An elderly woman in 8F asked, very quietly, whether he could get one to land on her hand. He looked at her. She was perhaps 80. Her hands were folded in her lap and were shaking slightly. "Yes," he said. "Would you like that? My husband kept bees." She said, "In Limburg. He died in March. I haven't been near one since, and I thought I never would be. And now there are," she gestured at the dim air, "and I find I want to." Namdi crouched in the aisle beside her. "Open your hand," he said. "Palm up. Rest it on the armrest so it doesn't shake. It's all right if it shakes, but it's easier for you if it's supported." She opened her hand. He waited. It took perhaps 90 seconds. A worker came down from the ceiling panel in the loose orientation loop, found the pale upturned surface, and landed on the heel of her thumb. The woman made a sound. "Don't move," Namdi said, gently. "You're doing it exactly right." She sat with the bee on her hand for about 40 seconds. Then it walked to the edge of her palm, groomed its antennae twice, and flew. The woman put her hand over her mouth. "Thank you," she said. "You did it." Namdi said, "I only crouched here." He moved on down the aisle. He did not look back, because she needed the moment to be hers and not something observed. He thought about it for a long time afterward. He thought about it more than he thought about the 11 seconds in row 6. Grace Muthoni, in Novas Prezece, watched all of this and did not participate in any of it, because she was doing the only thing she was capable of doing, which was holding her son's hand and monitoring his skin and counting his breaths. She had been doing versions of this for 5 years. Every restaurant, every park, every school trip she had let him go on, and every one she had not. Every flight, and there had been 11 flights in 5 years. And she had checked the auto-injectors before every one of them, and had never once needed them, and had never once believed she wouldn't. She had listened to the announcement from the forward galley with a specific and terrible clarity. This man is telling 260 people not to panic. And my son is the one person on this aircraft for whom the danger is real. She had thought about standing up and saying so, She had decided not to. And the decision had cost her something she would think about for years afterward. Because the reasoning had been, if I announce that my son is allergic, 40 people will start swatting on his behalf. And swatting is the thing that will kill him. So she had held his hand and said, very quietly, into his ear, Kelvin, listen to me. You have to be a stone. Can you be a stone? For how long? He had said. I don't know. A long time. Okay, he had said. He had been a stone for 50 minutes. He was 9 years old, and he had been absolutely still for 50 minutes with insects moving in the air above him that he had been taught correctly since he was 4 could kill him. Nnamdi did not know any of this until Cairo. When he learned it, in the hospital corridor at 6 a.m, from a mother who had not slept and was talking in the flat, overrun voice of someone whose adrenaline had been running for 9 hours. He had to stand very still for a moment. He was a stone for 50 minutes. Grace said, and then a bee landed on him and he moved. That's all. He moved. He was 9 years old, and he held still for 50 minutes with a Hymenoptera allergy in an open cabin. Nnamdi said, Mrs. Muthoni, in 51 years of working with these animals, I have not met an adult who could have done that. She looked at him. I should have said something. She said, at the beginning, I should have told the crew. You made a judgment under pressure that the risk of a panicked cabin exceeded the risk of an unannounced allergy. Nnamdi said, that judgment was correct. I would have made the same one. I would have made it slower. She started to cry then. Finally. In the way people did when the emergency was over and their body was permitted to file the paperwork. He stood with her. He did not touch her. Because he did not know her, and touching was not his to give. He stood with her until Reinders came out and told her the boy was stable. Kelvin Muthoni, at 9, did not remember most of the flight afterward. What he remembered, and what he told the school counselor his mother arranged, and what he was still telling people at 19, was this. There was a man walking up and down with a paper cup. He wasn't wearing anything on his hands. He just kept walking up and down. And I thought, if he's not scared, maybe the thing isn't as scary as I think. And then it stung me anyway. So, I was right to be scared. But he was also right. Both of those were true, and I've never worked out how. He worked it out eventually. It took about a decade. At 19, he wrote to Nnamdi, having found him through his university's library database, and asked whether he could visit an apiary. He was still allergic. He had a treatment plan and an immunologist and 4 auto-injectors, and he had spent 10 years deciding that he did not want to spend his life at war with a category of animal. Nnamdi wrote back and said yes. And set the terms carefully. Full protective equipment. Kelvin's own immunologist consulted first. A hospital within 11 minutes. This auto-injectors on the person of every adult present. And no bare hands under any circumstances. Ever. For Kelvin. For his entire life. You will never be able to do what I do. Nnamdi told him. At the apiary in Enugu, 4 months later, with the boy in a full suit and gloves and the veil sealed. That is not sad. That is a fact about your body, and it is the same category of fact as my inability to see ultraviolet. Which bees can. You can still understand them. Understanding is not the same as touching. Kelvin stood at the hive for 40 minutes. He is now, at 26, a pollinator, ecologist. He has never once been stung in a professional context. He works in modeling and remote sensing and does not need to open hives. And he is very good at what he does. And he has a photograph on his desk of a 9-year-old boy on a hospital bed in Cairo with an IV line in his arm and a slightly stunned expression. He tells people it is a reminder. He does not always say of what. The other thing that happened in the collection hour, and which mattered more than Nnamdi understood at the time, was that Wanjiru picked up a cup. She had been watching him for 25 minutes. She had been doing her actual job reassuring passengers, managing the dimmed cabin, moving up and down with water, and she had been watching the method.com. And at some point, around the 25-minute mark, she had walked to the galley, picked up a clear plastic cup and a napkin, walked to the seat back of row 15, where a worker was sitting quietly, and cupped it. Cup over the B. Napkin slid underneath. Cup inverted. She had done it correctly on the first attempt, which almost nobody did. Nnamdi, 3 rows away, had seen it and had said nothing at all, because saying something would have made it a performance instead of a thing she had simply started doing. She collected for 30 minutes beside him. She collected roughly 140 bees. Afterward, in Cairo, in the crew rest area at 5 in the morning, she said to him, "My grandmother had 3 hives, behind the maze. I used to sit and watch her work them when I was small." "Did she wear a veil?" Nnamdi asked. "Never," Wanjiru said. "She said the veil was for people who hadn't been introduced." Nnamdi laughed, really laughed. For the first time in 11 hours. "My grandfather said something very close to that." He said, the veil is a translation. If you learn the language, you don't need it. Did you believe him? Not for about 10 years. Nnamdi said. Then yes. Wanjiru was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I stopped telling people about the hives. When I moved to Nairobi, it seemed, I don't know, rural, like it marked me. Yes, Nnamdi said, I know that feeling exactly. And then tonight it was the only thing that mattered. Yes, he said, that happens more often than anyone tells you. She looked at her hands, which had propolis on them now too. I'm going to stop hiding it, she said. Good. Nnamdi said. The thing about the aircraft that Nnamdi could not stop thinking about afterward, the thing that eventually became the paper, was the ventilation. A honeybee cabin incident should have been much worse than it was. He knew this. He had run the numbers in his head at the time and more carefully afterward. And the conclusion was consistent. In a terrestrial enclosed space of equivalent volume, with the same number of bees and the same triggering event in row 6, the alarm pheromone plume would have reached behavioral concentration across a radius of 2 meters in roughly 9 seconds and would have persisted for 4 to 6 minutes, during which every bee that entered the plume would have been recruited into a defensive state. And each of those bees would have released more pheromone. And the cascade would have run. It had not run. It had not run because the aircraft exchanged its entire cabin air volume every 2 to 3 minutes, through HEPA filtration, in a continuous downward laminar flow from ceiling vents to floor-level returns. The pheromone had been pulled down and out before it could recruit. The single most dangerous behavioral cascade in honeybee biology had been defeated by an air conditioning system. Nnamdi found this so interesting that he lost most of a night's sleep over it in the Cairo hotel, and eventually got up at 2 in the morning and started writing on hotel stationery. And by dawn had the skeleton of a paper. The paper was published 14 months later in a peer-reviewed entomological journal, co-authored with a ventilation engineer from Delft whom he had cold emailed and who had turned out to be delighted by the question. It was titled Times Laminar Airflow as a Suppressor of Alarm Pheromone Recruitment in Apis mellifera, Observations from an Unplanned Enclosed Space Release. It was cited in the following 6 years. In contexts Nnamdi had not anticipated: greenhouse pollination facility design, laboratory apiary ventilation standards, and twice in agricultural extension guidance for smallholder beekeepers on hive placement relative to prevailing wind, on the grounds that the same principle applied outdoors at much lower efficiency, but applied nonetheless. His grandfather, he thought, had known the wind part. His grandfather had sighted every hive in that apiary with the prevailing wind at a specific angle and had never explained why. And when Namdi at 19 had asked, his grandfather had said, "So the anger blows away from the path." Anger blows away from the path. It had taken Namdi 37 years and an aircraft cabin to understand that his grandfather had been describing alarm pheromone dispersal. In 4 words, in Igbo, in 1976. Without any of the vocabulary and with all of the knowledge, he put it in the paper's acknowledgments. The journal queried it. He insisted. The acknowledgment, as published, reads, "The senior author wishes to acknowledge Chukwuemeka Eze, 1911, 1993, beekeeper of Enugu State, Nigeria, who described the phenomenon investigated here in 1976, in 4 words, and who was correct. The airline's incident review took 4 months. It concluded, in its formal language, that the outcome had been favorable, that the crew response had been appropriate and rapid, that the medical outcome for the affected minor passenger had been positive, and that the primary causal factor had been a manufacturing defect in the transport container. It also concluded, and this was the part that mattered, and that Kwesi had fought for in 3 separate meetings, that the decision to grant a passenger access to the public address system had been correct. This had not been an easy conclusion for the airline to reach. Handing the PA to a passenger was, in the ordinary run of things, close to unthinkable. There were regulatory questions. There were liability questions. There was a strong institutional instinct that said times the crew speaks to the cabin. Always. Without exception. Kwesi's argument, which he made in writing and then twice in person, was this: the instinct that the crew must always be the voice is correct in almost every situation. And I would defend it in almost every situation. It is correct because the crew has the training, the standing, and the accountability. In this specific situation, the crew had none of the relevant knowledge, not a little less than the passenger none. I did not know what a bee would do. I did not know that swatting was the trigger. I did not know that we had 9 seconds after an alarm event. If I had made that announcement in my own voice, using my own understanding, I would have said something reassuring and generic and almost certainly wrong. And 260 people would have received it as such. And the cabin would have generated its own narrative within 4 minutes. What the passengers needed was not authority. It was information. The only source of that information was in seat 6A. I would make the same decision again. I would like the protocol to permit me to... The protocol was amended. Not broadly, the amendment was narrow and specific and hedged with conditions, but it now permits, under defined circumstances involving a technical situation outside crew competence, where passenger behavior is the primary risk multiplier, the senior cabin crew member to authorize a briefed passenger expert to address the cabin. With the crew member present, it has been invoked 11 times in the years since. In situations having nothing to do with bees, Kwesi retired 4 years after Cairo. At his retirement dinner, when he was asked to name the thing he was proudest of across 17 years, he did not name a rescue or a medical event or any of the 4 decorations he had received. He said, "I gave a man a microphone in 3 seconds. I have thought about those 3 seconds more than anything else I have ever done." Namdi got home to Nairobi on the Tuesday and slept for 14 hours, and then went to the institute and did not talk about any of it for 9 days. This was his pattern. His wife, Adaeze, knew it. She had known it for 26 years and did not push. She had learned early that Nnamdi processed significant events the way sediments settled, slowly and in layers, and that the version she got on day 9 or day 14 was worth 10 times the version she could have extracted on day 1. On day 9, he came out to the veranda where she was marking exam scripts and sat down and said, "There was a boy." She put down the pen. He told her the whole thing. It took an hour and a half. He told her about the 11 seconds in row 6 and the woman in 8F with her husband's bees in Limburg and Wanjiru picking up a cup and Grace Muthoni telling her son to be a stone. And he told her about standing in a Cairo hospital corridor at 6 in the morning being unable to think of anything adequate to say. When he finished, Adaeze said, "You've been thinking about your grandfather." "Constantly," he said, "because of the veil, because of all of it." Nnamdi said, "Because everything I did on that aircraft was his. Every single thing. The gate, the voice, the open palm, the scrape with the boarding pass, the line about being frightened with your hands still, that's his. Almost word for word. He said it to me about a cow when I was 8 and terrified of it. I stood in an aisle at 11,000 meters, and I was a delivery system for a dead man from Enugu." Adaeze considered this. "That's not a complaint." She said, "No." He said, "It's the opposite. I've spent 31 years dressing his knowledge in citations. I thought I was building something on top of it. 3 days ago, I found out I've been carrying it whole." "Both," Adaeze said. "You built the ventilation paper. He didn't have that. He had the wind. He had the wind and no way to explain it to anyone outside that valley." She said, "You have the wind and a journal with an impact factor. That's not the same thing, and you know it." Nnamdi was quiet. "The chain gets longer." Adaeze said, "That's the whole job of a chain." He gave the paper to his students that semester as a set text. He taught. That year, a graduate seminar of 9 students. And one of the sessions he built around the Cairo incident, and he was honest with them about all of it, including the parts that were not flattering, that he had signed off the containment inspection on a crate that failed, that his professional error had put 11,000 animals into a pressurized cabin containing an allergic child, that the outcome had been good, and that the outcome being good did not retroactively make the error smaller. "I want you to hold 2 things at once," he told them, "because you will spend your careers holding them. The first is that I did the right things in that cabin, quickly and under pressure, and that people are alive and unstung because of 51 years of accumulated practice. The second is that they were only in danger because I had certified a crate that broke. Both, simultaneously. Not one canceling the other and not one excusing the other. If you cannot hold both of those at once, you will become either a person who cannot forgive themselves, and you will leave this field within 6 years, or a person who cannot see their own errors, and you will stay in it and do harm. Hold both." One of the 9, a Ugandan student named Peace, 24, who was the best listener in the room and who would go on to run a national pollinator program, asked, "How do you hold both?" "Badly," Nnamdi said. "For about the first 10 years, then better." She wrote that down. He watched her write it down and thought about a boy in a too large veil at a tree line in 1976, and about the specific mechanism by which anything at all got passed from one person to another, which was never a transfer and always a remaking. The receiver building their own version out of their own materials from the shape of what they had been shown. The chain was not a chain. It was a series of independent reconstructions, each one slightly different, each one carrying forward the part that had survived the crossing. His grandfather's 4 words had crossed. They had crossed 1976 to 2013, and Enugu to an aircraft over Sudan, and Igbo to English, and an apiary to a journal. Anger blows away from the path. Some things crossed. That was the entire point of saying them out loud. Lieutenant Stan Kovac had the specific sour geometry of a man who believed that 28 years on the city payroll entitled him to a quiet run-up to his pension and the absolute right to never be inconvenienced by innovation. He did not like surprises. He did not like officers who generated them. And he particularly did not like patrolmen who believed they had discovered a better way to do a job that Kovac felt had been perfectly solved in 1995. He sat behind a metal desk in the glass-walled supervisor's office of the precinct, the air smelling faintly of old coffee and floor wax, and dropped a thick, neatly bound manuscript onto the center of his blotter. It landed with a heavy, dismissive thud. Darnell Crew sat in the chair across from him and looked at the document. It was Commander Prentice's copy of Time's What the Block Knows, a 26-year account of resident observation in the Carver Street District and its uses. Commander Prentice asked me to review this. Kovac said, "Catchy title. Reads like a graduate thesis in sociology. Who exactly wrote this?" "Margaret Elstrom," Darnell said. His voice level. "She's a resident on Carver Street. She's a retired high school teacher with too much time and a third-floor window." Kovac said. He leaned back, his uniform shirt pulling tight across his chest. "I'm looking at your logs. Crew. Thursday afternoons. 2 hours logged as community engagement. That's a nice, fuzzy bucket to hide in, but I run the patrol roster for this sector. And community engagement doesn't answer 911 calls. It doesn't clear traffic accidents. It drinks tea with old women and writes manifestos. The tea with the old woman brought you the 1,422 narcotics bust," Darnell said. He didn't lean forward. "You the 1,422 narcotics bust," Darnell said. He didn't lean forward. He didn't raise his voice. "It brought you the Morrison Park intelligence before it turned into a gang injunction. It cleared the hardware store vandalism last month. Narcotics cleared 1,422, Kovac said, his jaw tightening. "You just passed a note. I am not turning this precinct into a neighborhood watch program run by civilians. We do not farm out police work to the elderly. We gather evidence. We make arrests. We file the paperwork. The paperwork records what happened after the fact," Darnell said. "Her notes record what's happening before the fact. It closes the gap. The gap is where police work happens," Kovac said. He tapped the manuscript with a thick finger. "Commander Prentice thinks this is a revelation. I think it's a liability. You're operating off book, relying on unvetted civilian surveillance, and you're spending patrol hours doing it. So I am solving the problem the old-fashioned way. You are transferred to the North End sector. Your shift starts Monday morning." Darnell looked at him. The North End was miles away. A landscape of strip malls and wide avenue, completely disconnected from the Carver district. It was a clean, safe, entirely sterile assignment designed to make a patrolman invisible. "Carver isn't handled," Darnell said. "Carver is perfectly fine," Kovac said. "You can take your community engagement to the retail parks up north. Your shifts on Carver are done. Effective immediately. You're dismissed." "Crew." Darnell stood up. He did not argue. He had learned, across 14 years on the street, that arguing with a man who had already locked his mind was a waste of oxygen that could be better spent doing the actual work. He walked out of the glass office, out of the precinct, and onto the pavement. He reached into his right jacket pocket. His fingers brushed the folded edge of Amara's crayon, drawing the police car. The sun. The yellow circle of a badge. He pressed his thumb against the paper for a moment, feeling the wax of the crayon, orienting himself. Kovac owned the patrol roster. Kovac did not own the street. And Kovac certainly did not own Darnell's Thursday afternoons off the clock. The May weather was unseasonably warm as Darnell walked the 3 blocks to the 1400 block of Carver Street. The neighborhood was alive in the specific way it came alive in the spring doors propped open. Music bleeding out of second-story windows. The ambient, low-level hum of a city block stretching its legs. He looked up as he approached the green building. The window boxes on the 3rd floor were full of geraniums. They were precisely red, exactly as promised. He buzzed 3B. Mrs. Elstrom let him in without asking who it was. When he walked into the small, neat apartment, she was already sitting at her desk in the study. She wore a pressed cardigan and her glasses were pushed up on her white hair. She took one look at Darnell's face and stopped arranging her pens. "You're wearing the face of a man who has been managed," she said. "Lieutenant Kovac reviewed your document," Darnell said, taking the chair across from her. "He transferred me to the North End. My official patrols on Carver are over." Mrs. Elstrom did not flinch. She simply nodded, absorbing the data point with the calm precision of a chemist observing a reaction. "Institutions do not like to be told that their windows are dirty," she said. "They prefer to look through the smudge and pretend it's weather." "I'm still coming on Thursdays," Darnell said. "I'm off shift at 3. The transfer doesn't dictate where I walk when the badge is in my pocket instead of on my chest." "Good," she said, "because the block does not care about Lieutenant Kovac's roster, and we have a new problem." She reached into the deep drawer of her desk and pulled out a folder. It was not the familiar 26-year file box. It was a new, bright red folder. Slim but growing, she placed it on the desk between them. "I started this 3 weeks ago," she said. "The name on the paperwork is Apex Holdings. It's an LLC registered out of state. But the men doing the footwork are local. They are trying to buy up the corridor. Gentrification isn't a police matter," Darnell said gently. "I am aware of what gentrification is," Mrs. Elstrom said, tapping the red folder. "This is not that. They are not making market-rate offers to property owners. They are targeting the vulnerability. They are only knocking on the doors of residents who live alone, who are over 70, or who speak English as a second language." Darnell leaned forward. "What are they saying at the doors?" "They tell the elderly residents that the city is condemning the building's plumbing, or that there are catastrophic code violations pending," she said. "They offer a fast cash buyout for the deed. Severely below market value. They frame it as a rescue. If the resident refuses or asks for time to consult a lawyer, the intimidation begins." "What kind of intimidation?" "The kind that doesn't leave a paper trail," she said. "Late-night knocks that stop the moment you look through the peephole. Dead rats left on welcome mats. Cut phone lines in the hallways. 3 days ago, Mrs. Gable on the 1st floor found glue in her door lock. She is 81 and uses a wheelchair. She was trapped inside her apartment for 6 hours until the super drilled it out." Darnell's jaw tightened. "Do we have descriptions of the men?" "2 primary operators," Mrs. Elstrom said. She opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper across the desk. "One is tall, heavy build, goes by Vance. The other is wiry, wears cheap suits, goes by Gable. They drive black SUVs. They park them aggressively, usually blocking the fire hydrant on the corner, to make sure the street knows they're present. I need to talk to the residents." Darnell said. They won't talk to you if you knock with a badge. She said, they're terrified. Vance and Gable told them that the police are working with the city to force the condemnations. They've weaponized the uniform against you. I'll walk the block. Darnell said. He stood up. I'll see what the street is saying. Darnell, she said. He turned back. Kovac took you off the beat, she said, her blue eyes pinning him. If you intervene here, and it goes wrong, you don't have the precinct backing you up. You'll be a civilian in a jurisdiction you're not assigned to. I'm not a civilian, Darnell said quietly. I'm the guy who catches people when they're going down. The precinct doesn't issue that. He walked back out onto Carver Street. The afternoon sun was warm, but the block felt different to him now. He looked at the fire hydrant on the corner. The curb was empty, but the pavement showed fresh, heavy tire tracks. He walked 2 blocks north, toward the expensive houses that sat on the slight rise overlooking the corridor, and he saw Gerald Fitz. Gerald was standing at the end of his long, paved driveway, holding a garden hose, watering a patch of grass that did not need watering. Darnell had not spoken to Gerald since that Tuesday afternoon in October, when Gerald had shouted at him from across the street. Darnell had simply let the man walk away, carrying the weight of his own error. Gerald looked up. He saw Darnell. His hand tightened on the hose nozzle, the water shutting off with a sharp hiss. He stood there for a long moment, wrestling with something heavy and awkward in his throat. Officer Crew, Gerald said. Darnell stopped on the sidewalk. Mr. Fitz. Gerald dropped the hose. He walked down the driveway. He did not have the red-faced bluster of October. He looked tired, and he looked like a man who was swallowing a stone. I owe you an apology, Gerald said. From last fall, I crossed the street and I shouted at you, and I was wrong. I was entirely, spectacularly wrong, and I was loud about it, which is the worst way to be wrong. Darnell looked at him. He could have let the man twist in the wind. He could have demanded more. He did not. You were reacting to what you thought you saw, Darnell said, his voice level. It's in the past. We're good. Gerald exhaled. A long, shaky breath. I appreciate that. More than you know. He hesitated, looking around the street, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of heavy stock paper. Are you still working this beat? Officially? Unofficially, Darnell said. What do you have? Gerald handed him the paper. It was a letterhead with the Apex Holdings logo. They came to my house on Tuesday. 2 men. A big guy and a skinny guy in a bad suit. Vance and Gable, Darnell said. Gerald looked surprised. You know them. I'm learning about them. Why did they knock on your door? You don't fit the profile. You're not vulnerable. I'm a holdout, Gerald said bitterly. They're trying to buy the entire 1,400 block, front to back, including the hill. They made me a cash offer. I laughed in their faces and told them to get off my property. Gerald looked down at his hands. The big one? Vance. He didn't blink. He just looked at my house, looked at me, and said, Fires happen in these old hills all the time. Jerry, shame if you slept through the smoke alarm. They talked to me like I was already gone. Did you call the precinct? I didn't know who to trust down there. Gerald said, I don't know those desk jockeys. I know you. Darnell folded the letter and put it in his pocket, right next to Amara's drawing. Thank you. Gerald, keep your doors locked. If they come back, you don't argue with them. You call me directly. He left Gerald standing in the driveway and walked down to 9th Street. Pushing open the glass door of the hardware store, the bell chimed above him. Solomon was in the back. leaning heavily on a cane. But his nephew, Aaron, was working the main register. Aaron was 24, sharp-eyed, and moved with the quick, efficient energy of a man who actually cared about the inventory. "Officer Crew," Aaron said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just Darnell today." "Aaron, I'm off the clock." Aaron leaned over the counter, dropping his voice. "Uncle Solomon said you might come by. He told me to start paying attention to the black SUVs." "What did you see?" Aaron pulled a small, spiral-bound notebook from beneath the register. It looked remarkably similar to Mrs. Elstrom's logs, just a generation younger. They came in on Tuesday afternoon. The big guy and the skinny one. They bought 3 cans of industrial spray paint, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters, and 4 master locks. Darnell felt the cold logic of the purchase click into place. "Did they say what they were for?" I asked. Aaron said, "I do exactly what you told me. Make polite conversation, see what falls out. The big guy told me to mind my own business." But the skinny one was laughing. He said they were securing vacant units for the city. "There are no vacant units on the 1400 block," Darnell said. "I know," Aaron said. "That's why I wrote down their license plate when they pulled out." He slid a piece of paper across the counter. Darnell took it. The network was working. It wasn't just Mrs. Elstrom in her 3rd-floor window anymore. It was Gerald on his driveway, and Aaron behind the register, and the whole quiet, breathing infrastructure of the neighborhood waking up and looking out for its own. "You did good, Aaron," Darnell said. "Are you going to arrest them?" "I need them to commit a crime first," Darnell said. "Buying bolt cutters isn't illegal. Using them is." He went home that evening. He picked Amara up from Loretta's downstairs apartment. They ate dinner. He read the Bear Hat book for the 52nd time, until Amara's eyes fluttered shut right at the part where the bear realizes he has seen his hat. He tucked the blanket under her chin, turned on the small nightlight, and went out to the kitchen to review the red folder. It was Friday night, 6:11 p.m. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the streetlights threw long shadows across the pavement. Darnell was off duty. He was wearing faded jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and a pair of work boots. His badge was clipped to his belt. Hidden beneath the fabric, his cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He picked it up. It was Mrs. Elstrom. "Darnell," she said. Her voice was perfectly measured, perfectly precise. But underneath the syllables, Darnell heard the rapid, shallow cadence of genuine adrenaline. "I'm here," he said. "They are on the 4th floor of my building." She said, "They are at Mr. Henderson's door. He is 82. He is completely deaf in his left ear. And he is terrified. They have tools. I'm 4 minutes away." Darnell said, "Do not open your door. Do not go into the hallway." "I am looking through the peephole," she said. "I am recording the audio on my phone. Hurry." Darnell hung up. He grabbed his keys. He knocked on Loretta's door downstairs, told his mother he had to step out for an emergency, and asked her to go up and sit in the apartment with Amara. "Be careful," Loretta said, pulling her robe tighter around her shoulders. "Always," he said. He drove to Carver Street. He did not use sirens, because he was in his personal truck, and because sirens give warning. He parked 3 blocks away and ran the rest of the distance, moving through the warm May evening with the silent, heavy grace of a man who knew how to run without drawing attention. He reached the Green Building at 8:22 p.m. The front door had been forced. The wood frame was splintered around the strike plate. Darnell slipped inside and took the stairs 2 at a time, making no sound on the worn carpet. He bypassed the 3rd floor, glancing only briefly at the closed door of 3B, and went up to the 4th. He stopped on the landing. The hallway was dimly lit. 3 men stood outside apartment 4A. 2 of them matched the descriptions perfectly. Vance, built like a refrigerator in a tight polo shirt, and Gable, twitchy and thin in a cheap suit. The 3rd man was carrying a crowbar and a heavy-duty padlock. They were hammering on Mr. Henderson's door. "Open up." "Old man!" Vance shouted, slamming his fist against the wood. "We have authorization from the city! The plumbing is condemned! You have 10 minutes to vacate before we secure the premises!" Gable laughed. A thin, nervous sound. "Just pry it. Man. He's probably deaf anyway. We lock him out. Toss his stuff in the alley. Deal's done." The 3rd man raised the crowbar, wedging the curved iron tip into the seam between the door and the frame. He leaned back, putting his weight into the leverage. "Drop the iron," a voice said. The 3 men froze. They turned. Darnell Crew stood at the top of the stairs. He was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. His hands were empty, resting loosely at his sides. He did not look like a police officer. He looked like a large, dangerously calm man blocking their only exit. Vance stepped forward, dropping his hand to his belt. "You lost." "Buddy, this is building management. We're executing a lawful eviction. Turn around and walk back down those stairs before you get hurt." "This isn't an eviction," Darnell said, his voice dropping into the quiet, heavy register that he used when the talking was almost over. "Evictions require a sheriff's deputy, a court order, and daylight. You have a crowbar, a padlock, and a Tuesday afternoon purchase receipt from Solomon's hardware store on 9th. Gable's twitchy confidence faltered. He looked at Vance. "Who the hell is this guy?" "I don't care who he is," Vance said. He took another step toward Darnell, trying to close the distance, trying to use his mass for intimidation. "Move along. Friend, you don't want to get involved in a property dispute." "Show me the court order," Darnell said. "I don't have to show you anything." Vance sneered. "Then you don't have a court order," Darnell said. "Which means you're not executing an eviction. You're executing a home invasion." Vance lunged. It was a fast, ugly Street Fighter's move, designed to overwhelm. He threw a heavy right hook aimed straight at Darnell's jaw. Darnell didn't flinch. 14 years of night shifts, 14 years of sudden violence in cramped spaces, took over completely. He slipped inside the punch, letting Vance's momentum carry him forward, and clamped a hand onto Vance's wrist, pivoting his hips and driving his shoulder into Vance's chest. He swept the big man's leg, and Vance hit the hallway floor with a crash that rattled the light fixtures. Darnell dropped his knee onto the center of Vance's back, pinning him to the carpet, and smoothly pulled the silver badge from beneath his hoodie, letting it hang on its chain in plain view. "Police," Darnell said. Gable and the man with the crowbar froze, their eyes locked on the badge. "Drop the iron," Darnell repeated. The crowbar hit the carpet with a dull thud. "Hands on the wall," Darnell ordered. "Both of you. Now." They complied. Darnell reached for his radio, calling in the 10-4, requesting backup and a transport unit. Beneath his knee, Vance struggled, his face pressed into the carpet. "You can't be here every night." "Officer," Vance gasped, spitting carpet fibers. "Apex owns half this block. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll burn this place out if we have to." "You won't," Darnell said quietly. Why not? Vance sneered. Because you're going to stop us? No, Darnell said. He looked down the hallway. Slowly, the doors along the corridor began to open. Mr. Henderson's door cracked open. The chain still engaged. The old man's frightened eyes peering out. Then the door across the hall opened. Then the door next to that, down on the third floor. Mrs. Elstrom stepped out onto the landing, holding her phone up, the red recording light blinking steadily. Because the building is watching, Darnell said. The street is watching. You thought you were preying on isolated people in the dark. You didn't realize they talk to each other. The April wind off the interstate carried the specific, sharp smell of wet asphalt and blooming exhaust. But on the 1400 block of Carver Street, the air smelled faintly of damp earth and hardware store lumber. Darnell Crew stood at the corner of Carver and 9th, his hands resting loosely on his duty belt, and watched the neighborhood wake up. It was a Tuesday morning, Lapin Livenblas AM, and the block was moving with the synchronized, unhurried rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were supposed to be. Across the street, Solomon was rolling down the heavy metal security grate of the hardware store. His nephew Aaron beside him holding a clipboard. 2 doors down, the owner of the corner bodega was sweeping the sidewalk, his broom rhythmically hitting the concrete near a patched crack that Darnell knew intimately. And up on the 3rd floor of the green building, the geraniums in the window boxes of apartment 3B were precisely, violently red. Darnell felt the folded square of paper in his right jacket pocket, Amara's drawing of the police car. The sun, the yellow circle of the badge, and pressed his thumb against it. It was a grounding mechanism, a small, private ritual that separated the man who read bedtime stories from the man who walked this pavement. Morning. Darnell, Aaron called out, stepping off the curb and crossing 9th. He was wearing a heavy canvas apron and carrying 2 coffees in a cardboard carrier. Solomon says if you've got 5 minutes, he's got a pot of something that tastes like engine oil but gets the job done. I'll take the engine oil, Darnell said, falling into step beside the younger man. How's the inventory going? It's going, Aaron said, his expression tightening slightly. Except we've had the city breathing down our necks all week. Fire inspector on Monday, health department on Wednesday, and some guy with a clipboard from zoning yesterday who spent 40 minutes measuring the distance between the paint aisle and the back exit. Darnell's stride slowed. Zoning? On a building Solomon's owned for 30 years? That's what I said, Aaron muttered, pushing open the heavy glass door of the hardware store. The bell chimed. A familiar, bright sound in the dim, wood-scented interior. The guy wouldn't leave a card, just wrote a bunch of stuff down. Told Solomon he'd be getting a notice of non-compliance in the mail, and walked out. Solomon was behind the register, leaning heavily on his cane, his reading glasses pushed up into his graying hair. He looked tired in the specific, bone-deep way of a man who had fought too many battles and was currently calculating whether he had the energy for one more. It's not just us. Darnell, Solomon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He slid a mug of black coffee across the counter. I talked to Elias down at the bodega. He got hit by the health inspector twice this week. Cecile's building had a plumbing inspector show up, unannounced at 7 at night. They're running a comb over the whole block. Darnell took the coffee. The heat seeped through the ceramic into his palms. Coordinated inspections. He said quietly, somebody is looking for leverage. Somebody is looking for a reason to put padlocks on the doors. Solomon corrected him. He reached under the counter and pulled out a manila envelope. I kept the security footage from yesterday. The zoning guy. Thought you might want to look at him. seeing as you're the one who pays attention to who walks this street. Darnell opened the envelope. Inside was a printed still from the store's overhead camera. The image was grainy, but the figure standing in the paint aisle was clear enough. Tall, heavy build, wearing a cheap polo shirt that strained across his shoulders. He didn't look like a zoning official. He looked like a man who broke things for a living. Darnell recognized him instantly. Vance. The same Vance who had tried to break into Mr. Henderson's apartment on the 4th floor of Mrs. Elstrom's building 6 months ago. The same Vance who worked for Apex Holdings, the predatory real estate LLC that had tried to buy up the corridor through intimidation and illegal lockouts, until Darnell had put a knee in his back and a badge in his face. Apex had retreated after that night, their operators vanishing when Commander Prentice started looking into their business licenses. But they hadn't left. They had simply changed their tactics. They had swapped the crowbars for clipboards, weaponizing the city's own bureaucracy to do the dirty work for them. "This man isn't zoning," Darnell said, his voice dropping into the heavy, flat register. That meant the pleasantries of the morning were entirely over. "His name is Vance. He's a private operator for a real estate firm called Apex." Aaron stared at him. "How is a private real estate thug walking around with a city clipboard writing citations? Because somebody inside the city gave it to him," Darnell said. He folded the photograph and slid it into his pocket. Right behind Amara's drawing. "Solomon. If he comes back, you don't engage. You don't let him in the back room. You tell him to wait for your lawyer. And you call me. Directly. I've been on this block 30 years. Solomon said quietly. "I'm not letting a man in a tight shirt run me off it." "You're not going anywhere," Darnell said. "I'll be back." He left the hardware store and walked back out into the April sunlight. The street looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes ago. But the architecture beneath it had shifted. The threat was no longer isolated to dark hallways and broken locks. It had mutated. It had acquired a veneer of legitimacy, which made it infinitely more dangerous. He walked the 3 blocks to the green building with the window boxes. It was a Thursday. He was off shift at 3. But the street did not care about the patrol roster. And the timeline had just accelerated. He buzzed 3B. "The door is unlocked." Mrs. Elstrom's voice came through the intercom, crisp and unbothered. Darnell climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his boots making no sound on the worn runner. When he pushed open the door to apartment 3B, Mrs. Elstrom was sitting at her desk in the small study. The light from the window caught the dust motes dancing above the 26-year box of notes. But the box was pushed to the side. In the center of the desk was a new, bright red folder. "You're early," she said, without looking up from the notebook she was writing in. "I expected you at 3:15. "The block is moving fast today," Darnell said, taking the chair across from her. "Vance is back. Apex Holdings." Mrs. Elstrom stopped writing. She capped her pen with a sharp, decisive click. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop and had just heard it hit the floorboards. "They are not just back," she said, her blue eyes pinning him. "They have evolved. They realize that brute force in a hallway draws police attention. Bureaucratic force draws compliance. Solomon got hit by a zoning inspector who was actually Vance," Darnell said. "Elias got hit by health. Cecile had plumbing. They're trying to generate enough code violations to force condemnations. And they are doing it with official city seals on their paperwork," Mrs. Elstrom said. She opened the red folder and rotated it so Darnell could read the contents. Inside were 3 photocopies of official city notices. One was a stop work order for a building on 10th. One was a health department citation for the bodega. One was a preliminary condemnation warning for the green building itself, citing structural instabilities in the roof parapet, the exact place where Amara had drawn the sparrows. "Where did you get these?" Darnell asked, his eyes scanning the dense, bureaucratic legalese. Cecile found the condemnation warning taped to the front door at 6 this morning. "Mrs. P. Elstrom said. She brought it up to me because she was terrified. The other two came from my network. Elias brought me the health citation. The stop work order was slipped under my door by a resident on 10th who knows I keep track of these things." Darnell looked at the bottom of the condemnation warning. The signature line was stamped with a name: Director Gregory Thorne, Office of Urban Development and Infrastructure. Gregory Thorne. Darnell read aloud. "Yes. Mrs. Elstrom said, I spent the morning making phone calls. As a retired teacher, I have a certain amount of latitude to act as a confused, concerned citizen when calling city offices. It is a highly effective disguise." Darnell felt a grim smile pull at the corner of his mouth. What did the confused citizen find out? "I found out that Director Thorne was appointed 8 months ago," she said. "He oversees a specialized task force designed to fast-track neighborhood revitalization. The task force has the authority to deputize private contractors to perform initial site assessments. Those deputies are issued city clipboards, city badges, and city authority. And Thorne deputized Apex Holdings," Darnell said, the cold mechanics of the scheme snapping into place. "Apex gets the authority to harass the block. They write up fake or exaggerated violations. Thorne rubber stamps the condemnations. The property owners panic and sell at rock-bottom prices to clear the liens. Apex buys the block for pennies, bulldozes it, and builds luxury condos. A perfectly legal theft," Mrs. Elstrom said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, distilled anger, laundered through the city's own paperwork. "It's only legal if Thorne is clean," Darnell said, "and Thorne isn't clean. You don't hand police powers to a thug like Vance without a kickback. Proving a kickback requires access to financial records." Darnell. Mrs. Elstrom said, "We have 26 years of neighborhood observations. We do not have subpoena power." "No," Darnell said, standing up. "But I know someone at the infrastructure office who owes this neighborhood a conversation. You taught her." Mrs. Elstrom's eyes brightened. "Priya Voss, class of 2001, Darnell said. "Terrible at balancing equations. Good at understanding why things break down. She is the deputy director of records." Mrs. Elstrom said, "She sits 2 doors down from Thorne. If there is a paper trail connecting Thorne to Apex Holdings, Priya has access to the server where it lives." She looked at Darnell steadily. "She is a cautious woman." Darnell. "She will not risk her pension for a patrol officer she does not know." "She won't be doing it for me," Darnell said. He reached into the red folder and took the copy of the condemnation warning. "She'll be doing it because the woman who taught her chemistry is about to lose her home." The Office of Urban Development and Infrastructure was located downtown, a 30-minute drive from the Carver Street district, in a glass and steel building that smelled of floor wax and recycled air. Darnell walked through the sliding doors at 1:15 p.m., his uniform pressed, his badge gleaming on his chest. He did not look like a man on a rogue errand. He looked like an officer with official business, which was the armor the uniform provided. He found Priya Voss in a cubicle farm on the 4th floor. She was a woman in her early 40s, wearing thick-rimmed glasses and a tailored blazer, staring at a dual monitor setup with the expression of someone who was solving a puzzle she did not particularly enjoy. Darnell stopped at the edge of her cubicle. Priya Voss? She looked up, her eyes dropping immediately to his badge, then rising to his face. A flicker of anxiety crossed her features, quickly masked by bureaucratic neutrality. Yes. Can I help you? Officer? I'm Officer Crew, Darnell said, keeping his voice pitched low so it wouldn't carry over the low partition walls. I walk the Carver Street district. Priya's posture stiffened infinitesimally. Carver Street. Okay. Are you here about a specific permit? Usually, police requests go through the legal department. I'm not here officially, Darnell said. I'm here because Mrs. Margaret Elstrom asked me to come. Priya froze. The bureaucratic neutrality vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring vulnerability. Mrs. Elstrom? She whispered. From Carver High? She lives in the green building on the 1400 block, Darnell said. He pulled the photocopied condemnation warning from his pocket and placed it quietly on her desk, right between her keyboard and her coffee mug. Or, she does for now, until Director Thorne bulldozes it. Priya looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. Her eyes scanned the signature at the bottom, and her throat worked as she swallowed. I can't talk about this, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You need to leave. I can't leave, Darnell said, leaning forward slightly, bringing his center of gravity down so he was speaking directly into her space without looming. Because if I leave, an 80-year-old woman in a wheelchair on the first floor gets locked out of her apartment. A hardware store owner who has anchored that block for 30 years loses his livelihood. A mother of 3 gets put in a shelter. And Mrs. Elstrom, who spent 31 years teaching kids from that neighborhood how to build a life, gets evicted by a thug with a fake badge. I don't issue the badges, Priya said defensively, her hands curling into fists in her lap. Thorne runs the revitalization task force. I just manage the database. Then you see the data, Darnell said. You see the pattern. Apex Holdings LLC gets the deputized authority. They write the violations. Thorne rubber stamps the condemnations. Apex buys the properties through blind trusts. It's a closed loop. Priya, and you're sitting in the middle of it. If I access those files and leak them, Thorne will know it was me, she said, looking around the cubicle farm as if expecting Thorne himself to materialize. He tracks the server logs. He fired an auditor last month just for asking questions about the Carver block assessments. I have a mortgage. Officer Crew. I have kids in college. I can't be a whistleblower. Darnell looked at her. He saw the fear. It was real. And it was valid. And he was not going to bully a frightened woman into ruining her life. That was what Apex did. I'm not asking you to leak the files, Darnell said quietly. I'm asking you to point me to the loophole. Every corrupt system has a blind spot, a place where the paperwork doesn't line up. You know how things break down. Priya, Mrs. Elstrom told me. She said, you understand the architecture of failure better than anyone. Priya stared at him, her eyes wide behind her glasses. She said that? She said it. Darnell confirmed. How is Thorne laundering the kickbacks? Apex isn't handing him envelopes of cash in a parking garage. How is he getting paid? Priya looked down at her keyboard. She bit her lower lip. The silence stretched out, filled only by the hum of the HVAC system and the distant clatter of a printer. Finally, she let out a slow, shaky breath. It's not cash, she whispered, leaning closer to the monitors. It's consulting fees. Thorne's wife owns a boutique environmental consulting firm. Whenever Apex acquires a condemned property, they are legally required to hire an environmental consultant to clear the site for redevelopment. Darnell felt the icy thrill of a locked door clicking open, and they hire Thorne's wife's firm. Exclusively, Priya said, and the firm charges 10 times the market rate for the site surveys. The money moves from Apex to the consulting firm, completely legally, on paper, and then flows straight into Thorne's joint bank accounts. Do you have the name of the consulting firm? Priya grabbed a sticky note and a pen. She wrote down 3 words, Verdant Solutions Group. She slid the note across the desk. That firm has no physical office. Priya said, not looking at him. It's a registered agent address in Delaware. But the billing invoices are routed through a local server. If someone with a warrant were to look at the billing history of Verdant Solutions Group, they would find that they have only ever billed one client in their entire corporate existence, Apex Holdings. Darnell took the sticky note and folded it into his pocket. Thank you, Priya. Don't thank me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Just tell Mrs. Elstrom I balanced the equation. I'll tell her, Darnell said. He walked out of the building and back to his cruiser. The afternoon sun was hot against the dashboard, but Darnell felt a cold, clear focus settling over him. He had the connection. He had the mechanism of the theft. Now he needed the hammer. At 4 p.m., Darnell sat in the glass-walled office of Commander Patricia Prentice at the precinct. Prentice was reviewing the red folder Mrs. Elstrom had provided, alongside the sticky note with Times Verdant Solutions Group, Times written on it. Prentice was a commander who did not suffer fools. Panic. Or unverified hunches. She operated on evidence, leverage, and timing. She looked at Darnell across the desk. You are alleging, Prentice said, her tone meticulously neutral, that the director of urban development is running a localized racketeering operation using a shell consulting firm to extort property owners in the Carver Street district. Yes, ma'am, Darnell said, and they are escalating. They posted a preliminary condemnation notice on the Green Building at 1400 Carver this morning. They are trying to force the residents out before the weekend. Prentice tapped a pen against the desk. A sticky note from a terrified deputy director is not probable cause for a warrant. Crew, if I take this to a judge, he's going to laugh me out of chambers. I need a paper trail. I need a witness. Or I need Thorne on tape. We can't get Thorne on tape, Darnell said. He insulates himself. The only people on the ground are Vance and the Apex thugs. Then get me Vance, Prentice said. If Vance is acting as a deputized city inspector, he is bound by the criminal statutes governing official misconduct. If he steps over the line, if he uses physical intimidation while claiming city authority, that is a felony. I can arrest him for impersonating an officer or official oppression. Once Vance is in an interrogation room facing 5 years, he will trade Thorne for a plea deal in a heartbeat. Vance is smart, Darnell said. He knows the line. He stands in doorways and smiles and hands over paperwork. He doesn't throw punches unless he knows he's unobserved. Then you make sure he's observed, Prentice said quietly. She leaned back in her chair. You have a network. Crew, you have 26 years of neighborhood observation sitting in a file box. You know where Vance is going to be before he gets there. Use the block. Darnell looked at her. Prentice was officially authorizing him to use Mrs. Elstrom's network as an operational intelligence asset. It was the closing of the gap, the final integration of the street's knowledge with the precinct's power. I need an unmarked car, Darnell said, and I need Holloway on standby. You have them, Prentice said. Go catch him! Friday evening, Alta, Kirkbesh-Peme. The Carver Street district was settling into the gold and purple light of dusk. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, stark shadows across the pavement. Darnell sat in an unmarked sedan, parked 2 blocks north of Morrison Park, watching the street through the windshield. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Jerome. Jerome was 18 now, wearing a dark hoodie, his posture radiating a nervous, hyper-vigilant energy. He had been deciding about college for 6 months, and he had finally decided to go. He was leaving in August, but right now, he was still here. And he was the eyes Darnell needed. "They're moving," Jerome said, staring at his phone. He had a group chat open with Aaron from the hardware store and 2 other kids from the neighborhood. Aaron says a black SUV just pulled up behind Cecile's building. 2 guys got out, heavy-set, carrying clipboards. "Vance," Darnell said. He keyed his radio. "Holloway. Suspect vehicle is on site at 1412 Carver. Rear alley. 2 operators. Moving to intercept. Copy. Crew. We are holding a 2-block perimeter." Holloway's voice crackled back. "Do not engage until they commit." Darnell put the sedan in gear and pulled smoothly away from the curb. "Jerome, you stay in the car. Keep the doors locked. If anything goes sideways, you call dispatch and tell them my badge number." "I'm not a kid, Darnell," Jerome said defensively. "I can back you up." "You're a kid who has a college acceptance letter," Darnell said, his voice hard. "You are not risking that letter for a street fight with a real estate thug. You stay in the car. That is the job." Jerome exhaled sharply. "Yeah. Okay. Be careful." "Man." Darnell parked at the mouth of the alley behind the green building. He killed the headlights and stepped out of the vehicle, moving into the shadows of the brickwork. The alley smelled of wet cardboard and old rain. He unclipped the safety strap on his holster. Resting his hand loosely on the grip of his flashlight, he moved silently down the alley, tracking the sounds. Up ahead, near the rear fire escape of Cecile's building, 2 men were standing by a rusted security door. One was Vance, his massive shoulders straining his polo shirt. The other was a younger, twitchy man Darnell didn't recognize. Vance had a heavy iron crowbar in his hand. He wasn't carrying a clipboard. "Just pop the hinges," Vance was saying to the twitchy man, his voice a low, ugly growl. "Thorne said he wants the water main shut off tonight. If the building has no running water for 48 hours, health and safety automatically condemn it by Monday morning. The old bat on the 3rd floor will have to leave." "What if somebody hears us?" the younger man asked, looking nervously up at the windows. "Nobody in this neighborhood calls the cops." Vance sneered. "And if they do? We flash the city badges and tell them it's an emergency municipal shutoff. Just pry the damn door." The younger man wedged the crowbar into the seam of the security door. He leaned back, putting his weight onto the iron. Metal shrieked against metal. Darnell stepped out of the shadows. "That's a felony," Darnell said. The 2 men froze. Vance spun around, his hand dropping instinctively toward his waistband. The younger man dropped the crowbar with a clatter that echoed loudly in the narrow alley. Darnell stood 10 feet away, fully illuminated by the amber glow of a nearby security light. He wasn't wearing his uniform jacket. He was wearing his patrol shirt, the badge gleaming clearly on his chest. "Officer Crew," Vance said, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who believed he held all the cards. "You're out of your jurisdiction. Buddy, we are authorized municipal contractors. We have a work order to inspect the main line." Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated city ID badge, tossing it onto the pavement at Darnell's feet. "A municipal work order requires a marked city vehicle, an active permit filed 24 hours in advance, and daylight Darnell said, his voice perfectly level, carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of a man who owned the street he was standing on. You are holding a crowbar at 7 o'clock on a Friday night trying to breach a residential utility room. That is breaking and entering. It is trespassing. And because you just threw a fake badge at my feet, it is impersonating a municipal official. Vance's smile vanished. He took a step forward, his mass shifting aggressively. You think you can arrest me? I work for Gregory Thorne. Thorne owns your captain. You put cuffs on me. You'll be directing traffic at a strip mall by Tuesday. Darnell didn't move. He didn't reach for his weapon. He simply reached up and keyed the microphone on his shoulder. Holloway, suspects are attempting a breach of the utility main. Unauthorized tools. Fake municipal identification. Move in. At the ends of the alley, the darkness shattered. 4 patrol cars swung into the narrow corridor from both directions, their light bars painting the brick walls in strobing. Violent arcs of red and blue. The tires shrieked as they boxed the black SUV in perfectly. The doors opened in unison, and 6 uniformed officers stepped out, forming an unbreakable perimeter around Vance and his partner. Sergeant Holloway walked slowly down the center of the alley, his thumbs tucked into his belt. He looked at the crowbar on the ground, then at the fake badge, and finally at Vance. You look like a man who just ran out of leverage, Holloway said mildly. Vance stared at the flashing lights. The raw, visceral reality of his situation finally crashing through his arrogance. The twitchy partner immediately put his hands on his head and dropped to his knees, utterly broken by the show of force. Vance looked at Darnell, his eyes burning with pure, distilled hatred. You're a dead man. Crew. Darnell stepped forward. Unhooking his cuffs, he grabbed Vance's wrist, twisting his arm sharply behind his back with the practiced, efficient violence of a man who had secured 1,000 arrests. He snapped the steel cuffs shut. I'm the man who stops the breaking, Darnell said quietly into Vance's ear. You have the right to remain silent. I highly recommend you use it until we ask you about Gregory Thorne. The interrogation of Vance took exactly 47 minutes. Commander Prentice had been correct. Vance was a predator who thrived on intimidating the weak. But when placed in a windowless room with Holloway and a federal prosecutor, facing 15 years for racketeering, extortion, and official misconduct, his loyalty to Apex Holdings evaporated like water on a hot skillet. He gave up Thorne. He gave up the routing numbers for Verdant Solutions Group. He gave up the emails detailing the exact timeline of the planned condemnations for the Carver Street district. By Monday morning, Gregory Thorne was arrested by the state police as he walked into the Office of Urban Development. The CEO of Apex Holdings was indicted by a federal grand jury on 34 counts of fraud and racketeering. The condemnation notices on the Carver Street district were officially rescinded by 10 a.m. on Tuesday. It did not make the evening news in a major way. It was a bureaucratic corruption scandal, complex and uncinematic, buried in the middle pages of the Metro section. There were no riots, no dramatic press conferences. But on the 1400 block of Carver Street, the air felt different. It felt lighter. The threat of the bulldozers had lifted, leaving behind the ordinary, manageable struggles of a neighborhood that was, for the first time in a long time, allowed to simply exist. On Thursday afternoon, at 3:15 p.m., Darnell climbed the 3 flights of stairs in the Green Building. He was wearing his uniform, holding a manila envelope in one hand and holding Amara's hand with the other. Amara was wearing a bright yellow raincoat. Despite the clear weather, because she had decided that yellow was the required color for Thursdays. Mrs. Elstrom buzzed them in and stood in the open doorway of apartment 3B. leaning on her walker. She was wearing a crisp cardigan, her white hair perfectly arranged. "You are exactly on time," she said. "The block is moving at normal speed today," Darnell said. Amara marched past Mrs. Elstrom, completely unbothered by formalities. "I brought a new drawing," she announced. "It has 4 birds this time. Ferdinand had a baby. I look forward to adding it to the gallery," Mrs. Elstrom said. She watched Amara disappear into the kitchen, then turned her assessing blue eyes on Darnell. "I read the newspaper this morning. The small article on page 6. Darnell handed her the manila envelope. "Official copies of the rescinded condemnation orders," he said, "signed by a judge. The building is safe. Solomon's store is safe. The whole corridor is clear." Mrs. Elstrom took the envelope. She didn't open it. She held it against the handles of her walker, her hands resting quietly over the paper. For a moment, the fierce, uncompromising intellect that defined her seemed to soften, revealing the very old, very tired woman beneath it. "I have lived in this building for 44 years, she said quietly. "My husband's ghost is in these walls. The idea of a man with a clipboard taking it away. I was more frightened than I allowed myself to show you." "I know," Darnell said softly. "You used the box," she said, looking up at him. "You used the 26 years. We couldn't have caught Thorne without it," Darnell said. "You mapped the symptoms. Prentice and I just prescribed the medicine." Mrs. Elstrom nodded slowly. "Priya Voss called me last night," she said. "She told me she was resigning from the infrastructure office. She said she is taking a job with a non-profit housing advocate. She said she was tired of watching things break down, and she wanted to start fixing them." Darnell smiled. "You taught her well." "I taught her chemistry," Mrs. Elstrom corrected. "You taught her courage. There is a distinction." From the kitchen, Amara's voice rang out, bright and demanding. "Daddy, you have to come look! The baby Ferdinand is eating a worm!" Darnell laughed, a deep, resonant sound that filled the small hallway. He looked at Mrs. Elstrom. "Duty calls. Go to your daughter. Officer Crew," she said. "I will see you next Thursday. This story is invented. There is no Carver Street District. No Darnell Crew. No Mrs. Elstrom. And no Apex Holdings. Gregory Thorne and his fake municipal badges exist only in these paragraphs. The red geraniums and the yellow raincoat and the 26-year box of notes are all fictions designed to carry a specific, heavy truth. You already know the truth. You know that the violence that destroys a neighborhood does not always arrive with sirens and shattered glass. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard, a fake smile, and an official city seal. It arrives in the quiet. Methodical weaponization of bureaucracy, the sudden inspections, the unexplained citations, the slow, suffocating pressure designed to make people who have lived in a place for 40 years believe that they no longer have the right to exist there. That kind of violence relies on isolation. It relies on the belief that the people on the street do not talk to each other, that the elderly woman in the window does not communicate with the man at the hardware store, and that the police officer walking the beat is too busy answering radio calls to notice the architecture of the theft happening right in front of him. The defense against that violence is not a superhero. The defense is a network. The defense is 26 years of paying attention. Stored in a file box. It is the hardware store owner who saves the security footage. It is the teenager in the park who keeps his eyes on the alley. It is the frightened clerk in the city office who decides, for one terrifying minute, to point a finger at the corrupted ledger. And it is the person who stops, the person who takes the file box seriously, the person who extends the arm and says, "I will connect what you know to the place where it can do something." Darnell Crew did not defeat Apex Holdings with his sidearm. He defeated them by walking the street slowly enough to read the map Mrs. Elstrom had drawn for him. He defeated them by recognizing that the street's knowledge was more powerful than the city's paperwork. So let me ask you, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. What is the clipboard in your own community? What is the quiet, bureaucratic pressure that is pushing people out, making them feel small, making them believe they have no power? And more importantly, who is keeping the box? Who is the person in your building? Your office? Your neighborhood who has been watching the patterns for 20 years? Waiting for someone to ask them what they know? If you are the one with the box, do not throw it away. Keep writing it down. The connection is coming. If you are the one walking the beat, whether you wear a badge, carry a briefcase, or just walk your dog down the street, stop walking so fast. Look at the window boxes. Notice the sparrows. Ask the person who has been there the longest what they see. The street is always talking. The corruption is always leaving a trail. The only question is whether you are willing to slow down. Sit at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon and read the notes. Share this story with the people in your life who pay attention. Share it with the ones who feel like their observations don't matter because they don't hold official titles. Remind them that the most powerful weapon against systemic cruelty is a community that refuses to be isolated. And subscribe, because there are more stories coming. More stories of the people who hold the line. The people who keep the records, and the people who extend their arms in the dark. The geraniums are precisely red. The baby Ferdinand is eating a worm. The street is safe. Not because it is immune to predators, but because the people who love it decided to protect it together. That is the whole inheritance. That is all.